Hi, grade 4. Today you're going to be listening to Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is called Casper Arrives with a Surprise. Lena was sweeping the floor of the kitchen when she heard a thump and a shuffle of hooves outside. There was a shout. In a man's voice, "Hello! Where is everyone?" And then a shriek from inside the house, running footsteps and Torrin's voice screaming, "Casper, Casper, you're home!" Lena flung down the broom and dashed to the door. There was Torrin clamped onto the front of a very large man, who was rumpling Torrin's hair and thumping him on the back. Behind the man was his truck, an especially large one piled high with boxes and crates pulled behind two huge oxen with curved horns. They stood breathing noisily, their sides going in and out. "Well, small brother," said Casper, "glad to see me?" "Yes," said Torrin. He unwrapped his arms from around his brother's trunk, gazed up at his face. "You were gone so long this time." "I had to extend my route," said Casper. "Quite far, in fact, quite far. The work of a roamer gets harder every year." Lena could see Casper's resemblance to his brother. They both had the same small eyes and the same wispy light brown hair, but while Torrin was narrow, Casper was wide. He had a wide, round, rosy pink face with a glistening round chin. It was almost a babyish-looking face, except for the tiny mustache on his upper lip, twisted at both ends into a point. Dr. Hester, who had been picking peas, came from the side of the house. "Welcome back, traveler," she said. "Auntie Hester!" cried Casper, flinging his arms wide. He stood that way while Dr. Hester walked towards him, and when she came close he gave her a hug that lifted her feet and her dusty slippers off the ground. "Don't do that," she said, her face squashed against Casper's shoulder. He dropped her back down. "I can't help it," he said. "You're light as a feather." "I'm not," said the doctor, rubbing her neck. "You're just showing off your muscles." "Well," said Casper, "it's true that being a roamer builds muscles." He made a fist and flexed his meaty arm back and forth. "Heavy things to lift, you know. Some exceedingly heavy. Out near the Camp Range foothills a few months ago, I got stuck in the mud and had to lift the whole back end of the truck, which was loaded at the time with..." Torrin jumped up and down at Casper's side. "Did you bring me surprises?" Casper looked startled. "Surprise?" "Yes, you always do a surprise for me." For a second, Lena felt sorry for Torrin. The look on his face was so hopeful. She had a feeling that Casper was more important to Torrin than Torrin was to Casper. Casper laughed. He had the oddest laugh. "Hee hee 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 hee," on one high, squeaky note. It hardly sounded of pleasure at all. "Well," he said, "as it happens, I did bring one surprise. It's more of a surprise for everyone, though." He looked back towards his truck. "Are you there?" he called. "Right here," answered a gruff voice. From behind the truck stepped a woman almost as big as Casper himself, a massive tree trunk of a lady with swirls and tangles of red-brown hair around her shoulders. She was dressed in faded blue pants and a huge brown shirt. She looked at them, smiling slightly. Her eyes were blue and fierce. "This is Maddie," said Casper. "She's my roaming partner." From Torrin there was silence. Dr. Hester held out her hand and said, "Welcome." The big woman pumped the doctor's hand firmly up and down 3 times, and then Dr. Hester glanced down towards the house and saw Lena standing in the doorway. "Casper," she said, turning back to him, "have you heard of what's been happening here since you've been gone? About the people who came from the underground city?" "I heard something like that," Casper said. "Lena is one of them," Dr. Hester said. "Come here, Lena." Lena walked out towards Casper, who squinted at her and then thrust a hand into the pockets of his pants and pulled out a pair of slightly bent glasses, which he put on. He peered at her through the cracked lenses as she approached. When she got close, he held out an enormous hand. Lena shook it. "Underground, eh? Some sort of mole people? But you got no fur." He laughed his squeaky laugh again. "Hee hee hee." Lena smiled politely at his silly joke. Something about Casper seemed to be slightly off, she thought. "Lena's sister Poppy is with us as well," Dr. Hester went on, "and their guardian, Mrs. Murdo." During all of this, Torrin had been standing very still. His narrow face had closed down. His eyes looked like tiny stones, and his mouth was pinched off small. He was staring at Maddie. Suddenly he cried, "But I'm supposed to be your partner." Caspar blinked at him, as if he'd forgotten he was there. You? He said, you're much too young. I'm almost 11, yelled Torn. I'm big enough. Not quite, little brother. He grinned at Maddie, who gazed back at him calmly. She was like a big rock, Lena thought. Her face didn't move. Torn scowled. Don't call me little, he shouted. He turned and ran towards the house. Caspar watched him go, lifting his eyebrows slightly. It's hard for children to accept change, he said. But they must learn, mustn't they? Dr. Hester said, Our 3 guests have been sleeping in the loft, Caspar. They'll have to sleep in the main room while you're here. How long do you think you'll stay? Just a night or 2, said Caspar. His face looked serious. I'm on a particular mission this time, heading for the city. The city? Thought Lena. What city? The doctor echoed her thought. The city? Why in the world would you go there? She seemed astonished, as if she'd never heard before of anyone going to the city. Because of this particular mission, Caspar said, of a secret nature. I see, said Dr. Hester. All right then, it's nearly time to eat. Take your beast down to the barn and then come in. That night, Caspar talked a great deal about his exploits as a roamer. In the northern forest lands, I came across some old cabins that still had glass in the windows. It was quite a trick to get the glass out without breaking. It took nearly 4 days, but I managed. I did cut my hand a bit. He extended his large hand and pointed to a tiny scar on his palm. Quite a lot of blood from that. And then up near Hogmarsh, I found a very valuable item. He gazed around them, smiling slightly. What is it? Asked Torn, who had forgotten for the moment to be mad at his brother. An ancient statue. It depicts some very rare sort of bird with a long neck and only 1 leg. You can see that it was once painted pink. He paused to let the wonder of this sink in. Pink tink stink, said Poppy. Pinky stinky. She stared at Caspar and giggled. Hush, Poppy. And then in Arden Wood, Caspar went on, I had to fend off a few bandits. Bandits? Cried Torn. Really? Well, they might as well have been bandits, Caspar said. Turned out they had no weapons, but they were set on stealing from me, that's for sure. I got rid of them with a few well-placed lashes. And a good thing, too. Because not far from there I located another special thing. Several boxes of authentic pre-disaster artificial flowers. They're made of very fine cloth, hardly faded at all. Artificial flowers? Said Lena, wondering why the people of Sparks would want fake flowers when they had real flowers growing everywhere. Yes. I have sort of a knack for finding unusual things. Maddie didn't join the conversation much. Once Mrs. Mordaunt, being polite, asked her if she enjoyed being a roamer, she only smiled a little bit and said, I don't mind it. There are worse things to be. Mrs. Mordaunt waited to hear about the worst things, but it seemed that was all she was going to say. When it was bedtime, Caspar went up into the loft and Torn dashed up after him. Maddie took Torn's place in the medicine room, saying a brief good night, closing the door firmly behind her. The doctor helped Lena and Mrs. Mordaunt make up beds of pads and blankets on the couch and the floor. Sounds interesting to be a roamer, Lena said. I suppose so, said the doctor. And Caspar has a special knack for finding things? The doctor bent over and spoke softly into Lena's ear. He has the knack for finding the wrong things, she said. He always brings loads of things people already have, and not finding the things that people really need. Artificial flowers, she said wearily. What are we going to do with artificial flowers? The bed being made, she went around the room and blew out all the candles but one. He's always been a bit odd, said the doctor. Looks as if he's gotten even odder since he was last here. He tries hard, though. You can say that. He has high ambitions. He wants to be a famous roamer. He doesn't know that he's a bit famous already among the roamers, but not famous for the way he'd like. She handed the candle to Lena and stumped off to her room. The next day was strange and unpleasant. Caspar sat in the big armchair telling stories about his adventures while Torn hovered around him asking questions. Lena listened for a while. She was curious about this work of roaming. It sounded exciting, like something she might want to do herself. But she got bored because it seemed to her that Caspar never said much about any really interesting parts of his adventures. She wanted to hear what the faraway places were like, and how the old buildings looked, and everything that was in the buildings. But all Caspar talked about was how brave and how clever he'd been to find the things that he'd found. and what injuries he'd suffered in finding them. Maddie didn't listen to Caspar. She spent most of her time in the courtyard of the garden, motionless and silent, gazing at the plants, her arms folded across her wide waist. Every now and then she plucked a leaf or blossom, rubbed it between her fingers, and sniffed it. Once she asked Lena what a certain plant was. "I'm not sure," Lena said. "I only know a few of them." "Then you know more than I do," said Maddie, flashing Lena an unexpected smile. But other than that, she said almost nothing to anyone. She didn't seem angry or unhappy, just off in her own world. Lena wondered about her, but felt far too shy to ask questions. After a while, Caspar's shoe torn away, sat down at the table, and pulled some scraps of paper from his pocket. He spread them out and bent over them, and his jovial, boastful manner changed. He ran his fingers along the lines of writing on the papers. He wrote on them with stubby pencils, and as he did so, he frowned and muttered and mumbled to himself, words that sounded like nonsense to Lena, except for the occasional string of numbers. 3,548, he would say. 44,209. She wandered up behind him and tried to look over his shoulder. After all, she had experience with torn documents and hard to decipher bits of writing. But Caspar twisted around and scowled at her, holding his hands over the paper. "Private, private, keep away," he said. He wouldn't let Torrin see either, so Torrin sat at the window and sulked. Around mid-afternoon, the doctor rushed in the door, looking even more frazzled than usual. Her shirt was smudged with blood, and her shirt tails was half untucked. "I'm out of clean bandages," she said. "Lena, did you do them? I need some. And I need that lavender extract, a bottle of it. No, I'd better get 2 bottles. She hurried into the medicine room. Lena had forgotten all about the bandages. She dashed into the kitchen and pulled some rags from the basket and tore them into strips. She took these to the doctor, who was on her knees rummaging through a chest. "And I'm going to have to make some mustard plasters tonight. You'll need to go out into the orchard and gather me some mustard plants. I'll need a lot. Get the leaves too, and the roots. I want the whole plant." She found her bottles of oil, thrust them into her bag along with the bandages, and rushed out the door again. Lena felt her spirit sink down into her shoes. She didn't want to go gather mustard plants. It was too hot. It was ferociously hot. She was sick of being hot, having her neck damp beneath her long hair, and her clothes sticking to her back. She was sick of doing chores. She shuffled out into the courtyard, where a few of the doctor's seedlings were drying up in their pots. She trudged to the pump, filled up a bucket, and splashed some water on each limp plant. Then she sat down in the shade of the grapevine and leaned against the wall beneath the window and thought about everything that was wrong. She was mad at the doctor for giving her so much to do and hardly noticing at all when she did it. She was mad at Mrs. Mordaunt for not moving them out to the Pioneer Hotel. And she was lonely. She missed being with people she knew. Especially she missed being with Doone in the old way. The way they'd been together when they were partners in Ember. Now he seemed to care more for his new friends than he did for her. Every time she thought about him, she felt a sudden thud of pain, like a bruised place inside her. From the window, just above her head, Lena heard Caspar's voice. "Not now," he said. "I have to do some planning. I need quiet." The door opened and Torrin stormed out. He threw a furious glance at Lena, but didn't speak. He ran through the great gate and up the road. "He's mad too," thought Lena. Everyone's mad. From inside, she heard Caspar's voice again. He was talking to Maddie, who must have come in the kitchen door. She realized that they were standing by the window just behind her. "We'll head out the day after tomorrow," said Caspar, "starting early." "Uh-huh," said Maddie. "All those stories about germs still lurking there, they're nonsense, you know. Those germs died out long ago." "No doubt you're right," said Maddie. "We're talking about this city." Lena sat very still and listened harder. "People talk about other kinds of danger there, too," Caspar went on. "Bandits and so on. It doesn't bother me." "Of course not," Maddie said. "And anyway, even if there is danger, it's worth the risk because of what we're going to find." "You sound very sure that we're going to find it," said Maddie. "Of course I'm sure," said Caspar. "Aren't you?" The answer to this was just a grunt. They moved away from the window. Their voices grew fainter. Maddie spoke next. Lena couldn't hear what she said, but she thought she caught the words, "How far?" and Caspar's answer she heard to those words was day's journey. Then she heard steps clomping up the stairs to the loft, and the room went quiet. Lena sat very still. Her bad mood faded. Other thoughts swirled in her mind. She was remembering the sparkling city whose picture she had drawn so many times. The great city of light. The city she had always believed in. Now Caspar was planning to go there. It wasn't dangerous anymore, and it was only a day's journey away. She knew, of course, that the city Caspar was talking about had been damaged, like everything else in the disaster. The beautiful shining city she had imagined must have been the city in the past, and the time before the disaster. In her mind, she revised the vision of her city. Some of the high towers would have toppled, and their windows would be broken. Stones from ruined buildings would have fallen into the streets. Roofs would be caved in. But the idea that struck her was this. Maybe the people of Ember were meant to restore the city. Perhaps their great job, the reason they'd come up into this new world, was to live in the city and rebuild it, so that once again it was glorious. Shining city. It was the glorious shining city of Lena's vision. This was such a beautiful idea. That night, she lay in bed thinking about it, and the more she thought, the more she was sure, and the more she was excited. End of chapter 12.